Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a really intense theological debate. You've got philosophy, history, and faith all colliding over four huge claims. It's going to be good. So let's set the stage here. The setup is so simple, but man, is it powerful. You have one atheist philosopher, Alex O'Connor, and he's making his case against theism in a room with 25 Christians. Just imagine that for a second. The whole point was to have this really respectful, but also really tough exchange of ideas. All right, first up, O'Connor starts with a big one. Maybe the biggest one. It's one of the oldest challenges to theism out there, the problem of evil. Or to be more specific, the problem of suffering. And here's how he frames it, which I think is really interesting. He doesn't go for some kind of gotcha logical trick. Instead, he just asks a question of expectation. Okay, let's just assume for a second that an all-loving, all-powerful God exists. Is this world, the one we actually live in, with all its pain, is this what you would expect to see? And he really zeroes in on a super tough part of this, animal suffering. Just think about it, right? Natural selection, we call it survival of the fittest. But what does that actually mean? It means the death, the suffering, the destruction of the unfit. O'Connor's point is that this brutal, kind of wasteful-seeming process, well, that makes a lot of sense if atheism is true. But if you're an all-good God, why would you choose that method to create life? It just seems weird. Okay, so what's the comeback? The Christians in the room offered up a few theodicies. Now, a theodicy, that's just a fancy word for an explanation or a defense for why a good God would allow evil and suffering. Let's take a look at the main ideas they put on the table. So you've got a couple of big ones. First, there's the soul-making idea. The argument here is that we need hardship and suffering to grow, to develop character, to become better people. Then there's a more, philosophical take, the idea of redeemability. This one says that all suffering can be defeated or made right in the afterlife. The idea is that a creature, even an animal, could look back on its entire life with all the pain and because of some incredible eternal reward would say, yeah, it was all worth it. And this is exactly where O'Connor keeps pushing back. He's like, okay, but what about the animals? These explanations like soul-making or free will, they're all about humans, right? They just don't seem to work for, say, a deer that starves to death in the woods. Or what about the billions of years of animal suffering, predation, and disease that happened way, way before humans were even on the scene? All right, moving on to the second major claim. And this one gets really uncomfortable. The conversation pivots from this big philosophical problem of suffering to something very specific and morally jarring. Passages in the Old Testament where it looks like God is commanding genocide. O'Connor brings up texts like this one, the command about the Amalekites. And the language, man, it is just brutal. It's absolute. It says to destroy everything, man, woman, child, infant. By any definition we use today, that's genocide. And the text says it was commanded by God. So the Christian responses to this really went down two main paths. The first one is a purely theological argument. God is sovereign, all humans are sinners who deserve death anyway, so God is perfectly just in carrying out that judgment. The second path is a literary one. This argument says, hey, you're not reading this right. This is what's called ancient Near Eastern hyperbole. It was just a common, over-the-top way of talking about a decisive military victory back then. It wasn't meant to be taken as a literal instruction to kill every last baby. Okay, so from the Old Testament, the debate takes a huge leap forward, right to the absolute bedrock of Christianity, the resurrection of Jesus. Now, O'Connor's main point here is about how we read the Gospels. He says, look, if you try to read these as straightforward historical documents, they start to fall apart under scrutiny. He points out that the stories of Jesus' death and resurrection are just full of contradictions. And to him, that suggests they're more like theological narratives, not C-SPAN-style historical reports. And he gives some pretty specific examples, like what time was Jesus crucified? Mark says it was at 9 a.m., but in John's Gospel, Jesus is still on trial with Pilate at noon. That's a 3-hour difference. Or think about the two thieves on the cross next to him. In Mark and Matthew, they both mock Jesus. But in Luke's version, one of them defends Jesus and gets promised a spot in paradise. O'Connor's point is, these aren't just tiny, insignificant details. They're major changes to the story. So what's the counter-argument from the Christians? Well, they basically said that, yeah, there are some variations, but the core of the Gospels is still based on real eyewitness testimony. In fact, they argue that little contradictions are exactly what you'd expect from different people recalling the same chaotic event. And for them, the real proof is that the disciples were willing to die, to be martyred for their belief that they saw Jesus resurrected. Plus, they'd say this isn't just some old story. It's backed up by personal testimonies and modern miracles happening today. And that brings us right to the fourth and final major claim. This one goes right to the heart of who Jesus was. The question is, did Jesus himself ever actually claim to be God? Here, O'Connor makes a case based on historical development. He argues that if you look at the earliest Christian writings, they paint a picture of Jesus as a special human, the Messiah, God's chosen one, but not as God in the flesh. All the really explicit claims to divinity, the I am statements, the I and the Father are one stuff, that really only shows up in the Gospel of John, which is the last one written and, the most theologically complex. So it really boils down to this central tension. Was Jesus a human Messiah who, over time, his followers started to see as divine? Or was he already hinting at his divinity even in those earlier Gospels? Through his actions, like forgiving sins, which was a huge deal, something only God was supposed to do. Or by using titles like Son of Man. Did those things already point to him being God? So, after all that, what are the big takeaways? One of the most fascinating things to come out of this wasn't really about the atheist versus theist divide. It was about the incredible diversity within Christianity. For instance, there was a participant from the Latter-day Saint faith who presented a totally different way of looking at some of these problems. And yeah, this was a really different take. In this view, God didn't just create everything out of nothing. Instead, God himself is bound by some eternal laws that have always existed, so he couldn't have created a world without suffering baked into it. And this is the really key part, human souls existed before we were born, and we actually chose to come here. We knew it would be hard, but we chose it as a way to learn and grow. So, did anyone change their mind? Well, no, not on the spot. But what the participants said afterward is super telling. They admitted that Alex's arguments really highlighted some weak spots in their standard answers. They respected him, they were impressed by how well he knew their Bible, and they basically all agreed that the whole thing was a fantastic springboard, as one person put it, for thinking more deeply about their own beliefs. And that really leaves us with this big final question to chew on. When you're having a debate that mixes philosophy, ancient history, how to read a text, and deep personal faith, what does evidence even look like? Who has the burden of proof? This whole exchange didn't really settle anything, but what it did, and what it did so well, was to lay out the massive questions that are at the very heart of this entire conversation.